I'm going to give you 5 tips for playing big repertoire with small hands. And at the end of the video, I'm going to use a couple passages from the repertoire that people would normally think require a big hand, but in reality don't. And you can play those passages just fine with small hands. So let's check this out. So my first tip is when opening the hand, open as if you're opening from the palm of the hand rather than from the fingertips. So a lot of times when people open the hand, it feels as though you're going from the fingertips. And it's almost like you're contracting your muscles to the point where these fingers are really tight, your arm's really tight and tense. And it sort of feels like you're being tugged apart at the fingertip. So instead, you want to open your hand as if you're just opening from the palm. Your hand will go to what your practical hand span is, and it'll just be there. So for me, on the edge or on the black keys, that's a ninth, okay? Now over the top, I can't quite get that. I'm starting to hit this F, this octave note here, but in the edge I can do that. Now if I feel as though I'm opening from my fingertips, notice how much more tense this is. I can't really go any farther, but it feels really uncomfortable. So that's a really important tip. Feel as though you're opening hand from the palm rather than from the fingertips. Now my second tip is whenever possible, let the piano passively open your hand or let the piano passively hold your hand open. So what this could mean is that as I come down on an octave, it's sort of like my hand kind of opens, but it's the keys that as my weight settles in actually forces my hand sort of open like this, kind of. Okay? Now, the other thing that I mentioned, which is let the piano passively hold your hand open, and that's the idea that as I'm sitting here, I'm not stuck in this rigid position. If I was to lift my hand up, my fingers would just release. Now that's kind of a relaxation or release mechanism that I have built into my technique, but it's also the fact that when I'm sitting here, let's say even if I play a tenth, which I can kind of do on the edge of the keys here, you can see my thumb barely reaches, but this actually doesn't feel bad at all. It doesn't feel stretchy in the hand. I'm thinking about opening from my palm, and I'm letting the keys kind of passively open my hand. So let's say in my left hand, if I have something where it's like, well, I decide I don't really want to roll it for some reason, I'm just kind of letting the keyboard hold my hand open, okay? Very underrated important tip, because that passive action, it's like if you take your other hand and you stretch your fingers apart, you'll notice that it feels very different than if you do that, okay? Now my third tip is on octave playing. I've known people who they have very small hands and they can only really play octaves on the edge of the keys, okay? So just like that tenth, for instance, I can do it on the edge, but I can't possibly do it over the keys. Now, sometimes people are like that with octaves. It's like this octave note, it's kind of like a ninth for me, where they're kind of running into this other note. So you can just play on the edge of the white keys. Now it's a little awkward for me because I'm used to playing up here. So it feels awkward, but this works just fine. And I've seen people that do this really well. Now, if you have a scale, for instance, that have black keys in it, or if you're playing octaves where there's black keys, you can also play the black keys on the edge as well, which will make it a little bit easier. Now, most of these, you don't run as much risk of running into other ones when you're playing, but that can still be something that you can do. Now, the other thing that I have to mention here is if your hands are small like that, don't try to play 4 on the black keys. My hands are slightly above average, so playing my 4th finger on the black keys is absolutely fine. But if you have small hands, don't. Just play 5 on the black keys. Now, on the edge to the edge, you'll notice that I have to move a lot. It's a little awkward because I'm used to that 4th finger on the black keys. You have to move in and out much more. You know, normally you'd play like this, where your hand doesn't have to move in and out very much. That's very efficient for octave playing. Now, if you have to play on the edge, obviously you have to move in and out much. This will limit the speed that you're capable of, but it can work just fine, okay? All right, my next tip is what I call scissor technique. And this is for chord playing or wide interval playing. Now, I didn't actually come up with this. I stole this from another teacher. It was actually, I believe, Dorothy Taubman, who first came up with this idea, or at least coined the term scissor chord technique or whatever. And that's this idea. A lot of times, when we play, our hand is very flat. Well, when we play a really wide interval or wide chord, it's very natural for the hand to actually turn sideways. And this makes a lot of sense because if I play this, for instance, with my hand totally flat, you'll notice that it accentuates that stretch between some of my fingers. Whereas if my hand is like this, my fingers are just raising and lowering kind of like this, which is very natural to do, right? And for instance, if I say play a fifth between 2 and 4 with my hand like this, or even a sixth, it feels very different than if I try to do it like this. This is unbelievably tense and awkward, whereas here, I mean, it feels awkward because I don't do that normally, so it doesn't feel like normal in that sense, but it doesn't actually really feel tense at all. It feels absolutely fine. So you'll notice that depending on what the chord is, depending on the fingering and the distance between each note, my hand will have a different position. Here, slightly tipped here, but that's because this is a long finger, this is a short finger. Mostly flat. Here, quite tipped to the side. Here, a little bit tipped to the side, and again, a little bit less. Now I can play that flat, but it forces my wrist to be in a different position. And it actually is much more comfortable to have the hand slightly tipped to the side. So it depends on the size of your hand, the length of your fingers, and everything else. But this technique is really, really helpful. Being able to play intervals with a tipped hand like that rather than trying to go flat. Very underrated tip, extremely helpful. Okay, now my next tip is use the thumb. Okay, so a lot of times we'll have really big chords where we can actually take 2 notes with the thumb, whether it's on the black keys like this. Okay, so my thumb is kind of flat, and my wrist has a little lower position. Actually, 2 is more comfortable there. That's another thing too. Really consider your fingering. If you're using an addition that has fingerings, don't just do the fingerings. Really try to find one that's comfortable. Here's another example of that, okay? I have something like this, and I have to play, C and D in this 5/7 chord, for instance, okay? So this makes this much easier. And in fact, something like this, where we actually have a 10th to that top note here, this is a huge chord that would be unplayable for most people, actually. But if I use my thumb flat like that, it works perfectly, and it's not hard, it actually feels fine. And notice again, on the edge here to get that 10th, but because I'm taking that note, both notes with my thumb, it's actually a little bit easier. Another example of this is playing a white key and a black key with the thumb slightly bent. Now this is kind of awkward, because I kind of have a weird, awkward position with my thumb, but it actually works. Now in the D major Rachmaninoff prelude, we have this, let's see here. I think that's what it is, right? So it's... whatever the notes are, right? So, but we have this chord, which would be unplayable, right? It's like, oh my God, how am I supposed to do that? I'm running into that note. And bam, easy peasy. Okay. So now I have a bonus tip at the end, and I'm going to use a couple examples to show you that most of the time when we think a passage necessitates a big hand, it actually doesn't. So the first one I want to show you is Chopin Opus 10 number 1, of course. Now I just started learning this piece because I think I'm going to perform it this fall, but in any case, I'm just going to play it slowly and I'm going to show you. So these are arpeggios. Don't let anyone tell you that this is going to help stretch your hand, okay? That's completely false, okay? So even this second one here, let's see here. That is a huge reach in that arpeggio. Oops. But the thing is that no one who plays it well tries to do that, okay? You shift from one note to the next. Now, really important key here is rotation. It sort of throws my hand, etc., okay? Now we could look at a bunch of different passages from that one, but I just wanted to show a little snippet right there. If you think my hand is too small to play this, think again. There's a way to play it with small hands. And I know this because there's many examples of famous pianists who have very small hands that play anything you can possibly imagine. Another example would be Chopin Opus 10 number 12, the Revolutionary. We have a lot of things in the left hand, like this. This is sort of that left hand part that's kind of, you know, through most of the piece. Again, here, people are like, oh, these, you know, these kind of wide intervals, 4, 3, 2, 1, and they're like, oh, it's really hard because I have small hands. The thing is that with this passage, or with the first example that I gave, if you just play one note at a time, so my hand is here, then it's 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 here, you'll notice that as long as you can manage a fourth or a third, then you can play just fine, okay? It's all about movement. So the entire time, my arm is sort of almost pushing my hand to those notes. In the middle section, we have this passage. Right? And I've talked about this in another video, but it's the same thing. It's just one note at a time. Sorry, I'm forgetting the notes. And then I just, again, this here, that has nothing to do with a big hand. No one can possibly play that. It's too big, it's 2 octaves. You're just gonna move. And another very important tip is that a lot of times what you'll notice in repertoire is that when you have some huge leap or things like that, listen to any professional recording and you'll hear them take time. So when a pianist is playing this, they take time. Okay, you'll hear that. And that's really important, number one, because that's virtually impossible to play, you know, straight with no, you know, taking any time there. But the other thing is it actually doesn't sound good if you play it straight. And I've tried. It sounds terrible. You listen to recordings having tuned your ear to this idea that they're not playing it straight, and you go, oh my gosh, yeah, they're taking so much time there, and I didn't necessarily realize it before, and it just sounds really good. It fits, okay? Another example is from the D major Rachmaninoff prelude. Again, you have a lot of these big chords that are actually written as rolls. So Rachmaninoff wanted them rolled. And that's because, again, even if he could kind of do that, he's still going to roll it because that just makes sense. But again, people will still say, well, even rolling it, it's just so hard because, I mean, look at that. It's like, you know, an octave and more than a half plus a sixth, right? So that's like, oh, that's so hard. Oops. So, but notice the shape that my arm is making. That's really important. But the other thing too is people will say, okay, well, you know, but the problem is you're using pedal and, well, yeah, when would you ever play that without pedal, right? It's sort of like people say, no, you need to practice Chopin Opus 10 number 1 without pedal, and you need to be able to play it perfectly legato. Well, that's silly because, again, when would you play it without pedal? So it actually doesn't need to sound legato like that. Okay? But even still, you're only doing 2 notes at a time, which that is a bad way to practice that. Let's just say that, because no one ever plays it like that. Oops, sorry, wrong notes. It's so awkward and it's so strange. Again, I've talked about this in other videos, but as pianists, we want to give the illusion of legato, the illusion of, cantabile. We want to give the illusion of, independence and, whatever. But ultimately, it's just that. It's an illusion, not necessarily a physical reality, okay? So I hope that these 5 or 6 tips are helpful to you. If you have any specific questions relating to these tips or other things related to small hands, put them in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you guys. And I hope that these tips will be helpful. I know that I have found them extremely helpful, even though I have slightly above average hands size. And so, for anyone who has small hands, I imagine that they will be even more essential and helpful. So thank you guys so much for watching. Happy practicing and good luck in your journey.